All right, now that we have considered the philosophy of Thomas Hobbes and have examined his theory of human nature and the principles of social and political organization that he derives from that theory, we want to jump ahead in time to the 18th century. We want to go to 18th century France and consider the philosophy of Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Now, obviously, a whole lot of philosophizing and theorizing took place between the 16th century and the 18th century. I'm more concerned to provide a kind of thematic or ideological comparison between Hobbes and Rousseau at this point, however, than I am to provide a kind of story of strict chronological development. One of the reasons is that Rousseau contrasts so sharply with Hobbes that I think that if we compare them side by side, it really throws both of their views into sharper relief. And in addition, as a bonus, it kind of paves the way for our discussion of John Locke, which is coming next, because Locke provides a kind of middle way between what you might think of as the sort of extremes of Hobbes on the one hand and Rousseau on the other hand. So let's go back then to Hobbes and just recap a little bit. Remember that according to Thomas Hobbes, human beings are material beings who are governed by the same deterministic laws of nature that govern the rest of physical reality. As a psychological matter, the fundamental principle that guides human decision-making and human conduct is the principle of self-preservation. It's kind of an enlightened or rational self-interestedness that is fundamentally behind all of our choices, all of our behavior, and from which the rest of his ethical principles follow. And so because of this, when we hypothesize the condition of the state of nature, a state prior to the formulation of any social contracts or the binding together of people into political structures or institutions. When we consider people in the state of nature, you'll remember that Hobbes sees this as a time of all-out war, of a war of all with all, where nature is red in tooth and claw and so forth. And the reason is because each individual, looking out for themselves as they are, fundamentally motivated by self-preservation and self-interest as they are going to inevitably collide with one another. And these sorts of fights and the state of perpetual war is going to arise from that. And it's only through the imposition, through threat of force, of laws coming from without, coming from the person of an absolute sovereign, that can keep people in check and maintain the peace, so that we'll be able to, the conditions that are required for the best form of life possible will be met. Okay, so that political conclusion that Hobbes draws sounds pretty dramatic. It sounds pretty radical. And it's easy to think that the reason he gives such a radical, sweeping political ideology has something to do with the way that he views the state of nature, the primitive state of human beings, as being so radically, in a way, corrupt, dangerous, and so forth. So the idea is the remedy, the political solution, looks as radical and dramatic as it is, precisely because the problem to which it is the solution, to which it is the remedy, runs so deep. Now, you might wonder why you should think of the state of nature as being as bad as Hobbes depicts it as being. Why think that human beings in the state of nature, as he hypothesizes, would be in a state of sort of perpetual war? Well, one reason for this actually relates to one of the ways that Hobbes' theory is very new and marks a dramatic break from the past, from ancient and medieval moral and political philosophy. And that reason is that Hobbes doesn't really find room for the notion of a natural moral law. And at least since the Stoics, all through the Middle Ages, most political and moral theorists, most ethical theorists, had believed in the existence of a natural moral law that governs human conduct even outside of externally imposed laws given in political institutions, say. So what I mean by that is this. A natural law is something like a universally binding moral principle that, again, doesn't need to be decreed by the state or by a sovereign, because it's a natural feature of reality emanating from human nature itself, and it is something that, by way of an enlivened conscience, and also by way of reason, all of us are aware of in some measure. So we all understand that just by nature, there are certain rights that we possess as human beings, and there are certain duties that are imposed upon us toward others, again, quite apart from what a sovereign or political figure might have to say. Now, Hobbes himself rejects this kind of view. He just doesn't find a place for natural moral law in his theorizing. Rather, everything for him bottoms out again in this fundamental principle of self-interest, okay, self-preservation. Rousseau is kind of allergic to this kind of view, right? Rousseau thinks that if you take up Hobbes' way of looking at human nature, the state of nature, and ethical conduct as being grounded fundamentally in enlightened self-interest, then you have skipped over, you have passed over human feeling and human sentiment, which again enlivens and makes us aware of the kinds of laws that we know by nature, and it doesn't really do justice to a presentation of the way that human beings actually behave in the natural state. So, you know, Rousseau, by contrast to Hobbes, thinks of human nature as being good in itself, thinks of human beings as being motivated not simply by rational self-interest, but by a sort of intrinsic sympathy or outwardly directed benevolence that is natural to human beings. And so because of this, he doesn't think of the state of nature as being as dire as Hobbes suggests that it would be. Rather, he thinks that the vicious characteristics of human beings, such as ambition, avarice, pride, competition, those sorts of things, arise and emerge only in the context when human beings begin to band together into larger scale people groups, into larger scale societies. So, you know, the kind of cartoon portrait of Hobbes and Rousseau suggests that for Hobbes, human beings are by nature corrupted, or at least they're driven only by egoistical and self-interested motives. And in fact, it's only when they bind themselves together in a society governed by the strong arm of the state that we can avoid the kinds of collisions, conflicts, dangerous circumstances that we would otherwise have to face in the state of nature. For Rousseau, by contrast, human beings are good intrinsically. By their nature, they're good. It's actually society itself and the imposition of societal standards that has a corruptive influence on the human person. In addition to that, you know, the top-down imposition of external standards, the indoctrination of you know, cultural mores brought about by way of state education and so forth, have the effect of stifling free expressions of individuality, have the effect of disallowing human potential from flourishing, human beings from being who and what they really should be. So, you know, in an interesting reversal, you have a kind of idealized view of human nature in the state of nature, and a negative estimation of the need for banding together in societies. Now, Rousseau's picture is tempered. It's more nuanced than that. But I think it's fair to see him as looking back to the sort of noble stage of human development before there was any need for a social contract of any kind. once the social contract becomes a necessity, whenever we must or do come together in a kind of larger scale social structure, in contrast to Hobbes, you certainly don't cede your rights. You don't give up your will or make your will subservient to the will of the sovereign. Instead, you retain your individual will, but your individual will becomes absorbed in what Rousseau calls the general will. So Rousseau is against the idea of a kind of absolutist sovereign monarchy. Rather, he is for a kind of egalitarian democracy in which everyone's will, somehow or other, is expressed and guarded by the general will of the people. So once more, the presentation I've given of Hobbes and Rousseau on human nature and on the organizing principles of human society is simply a scratching of the surface of their deep and influential theories. And it is something of a caricature or just outline to get us started in understanding their overall view of human destiny and human life. I do want to draw a connection, however, between Hobbes and Rousseau and some of the schools we've previously studied. It's very tempting to see a parallel between Hobbes and Rousseau on the one hand, and the so-called legalists and sentimentalists of Confucius' day on the other hand. You remember, Confucius sees himself as finding a middle way between two extremes, and it looks as though these extremes have surfaced again in the guise of Enlightenment philosophy. So it's easy to see or to think of Hobbes as being perhaps a bit too pessimistic and certainly too ham-fisted with respect to his political solutions to the problems that he was concerned with. At the same time, it's easy to think of Rousseau as being a little bit naively optimistic concerning human nature and a little bit too quixotic with respect to his political solutions. So the moral that suggests itself here is that, through the attempt to throw off the sort of ancient and medieval traditions and to start over from scratch, this kind of individualist starting over picture of philosophy that characterized much of the modern era. In going forward with this project, it seems that we ended up losing some lessons, losing sight of some lessons that had been learned previously, and therefore, at the same time, lost sight of the sort of nuanced or balanced via medias developed by philosophers such as Confucius, Aristotle, and others, which were meant to avoid these extremes. I mention that because, during this time period, there's a real need to find the right kind of balance, as there always has been. But instead of simply reverting to, say, Confucius or Aristotle, it made sense to think of the project as being trying to reclaim what was good and right in the past from these philosophers, but refashioning and reshaping it in a way that would fit with the needs of modern society. You can see John Locke now as entering into the picture at precisely this stage and trying to provide us with just such a refashioning.